In this episode, I break down Pope Leo XIV's new encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas, and what it reveals about the Church's response to AI, war, and human dignity in the digital age. I also dig into why its most striking features, especially around slavery and just war theory, feel less like final answers and more like the beginning of a much longer process of moral and theological integration. You're listening to Whiplash, a listener-supported podcast exploring Catholicism through the lens of queer liberation theology. I'm Max Kuzma, a transgender man and columnist for the National Catholic Reporter and board member of Dignity USA. Thank you to the paid Substack subscribers who make this work possible. Today I want to talk about Pope Leo XIV's new encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas. And while I'll begin by providing a general overview to help catch everyone up to speed on what the document actually covers, I also want to be transparent from the beginning about the perspective that I am bringing into this discussion. I am approaching this encyclical as someone whose lived experience has often placed me at the margins of the Church. But it has been precisely from those margins that my faith has deepened. My journey of transition has been an encounter with the spiritual life, a spiritual journey that has given me the gifts of discernment, expanded my understanding of grace, and helped me deepen my relationship with God overall. I have chosen to explore theological traditions that read the gospel from the perspective of those most affected by exclusion, oppression, and structural injustice. Traditions like liberation theology, queer theology, disability theology, Black theology, and other justice-centered approaches to Catholic thought. These traditions have fundamentally shaped how I understand the Church, human dignity, and the social dimensions of the gospel itself. And so, while this episode will absolutely engage this encyclical on its own terms, it will also be informed first and foremost by my perspective, by life on the margins, by theological traditions that emerged from those margins, and by the belief that some of the deepest truths within Christianity are often revealed most clearly through the experiences of people who the institution has struggled to most fully see. So, let's start with an overview. Magnifica Humanitas, or Magnificent Humanity, is Pope Leo XIV's first encyclical, released on May 25th, 2026, the 135th anniversary of Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, or Of New Things, which was issued in 1891 after the Industrial Revolution was underway. The title, Rerum Novarum, references the rapidly changing new socioeconomic realities of the Industrial Revolution. And, just a little bit on the Industrial Revolution to kind of, center where we're looking from. It took place from 1760 to 1840 and dramatically increased the production of goods in society through mechanization and factory labor, while also exposing workers to widespread exploitation, dangerous conditions, and new struggles over human dignity and rights. And, this is really, an echo of what we're dealing with today. So, you can really see why Pope Leo is situating his encyclical on AI within the context of this one. The official English subtitle for Leo XIII's encyclical was On Capital and Labor, and it addressed the condition of the working class and is considered a foundational text for modern Catholic social teaching. For instance, Leo XIII writes of the cruelty of grasping speculators who use human beings as mere instruments for making money. Speculators as in speculative markets. And he called for the government to ensure that the poor are, quote, housed, clothed, and enabled to support life. In this sense, Rerum Novarum argues that the state should not only make interventions for the common good, but particularly for the poor and the working class. This is that whole idea of looking at the world from the perspective of the poor, the least of these. That famous Pope Francis reference that Leo refers to here as well. In another passage in Rerum Novarum, Leo XIII writes, "But all agree, and there can be no question whatever, that some remedy must be found, and quickly found, for the misery and wretchedness which press so heavily at this moment on the large majority of the very poor." Today, Leo XIV's Magnifica Humanitas not only echoes these themes, but represents a very real continuation of many of them. In particular, right out of the gate in paragraph 3, he talks about Leo XIII and Rerum Novarum and says, quote, "With that document, my beloved predecessor gave impetus to the reflection on society, the economy, and politics, which is now known as the social doctrine of the Church." Now notice here that he uses the word doctrine rather than the typical expression we are used to, which is Catholic social teaching. This is very intentional. I don't always agree with the writer Michael Sean Winters from the National Catholic Reporter, but I like that in his essay, "The Three Most Important Themes in Magnifica Humanitas," he writes, "We usually refer to Catholic social teaching, but Leo repeatedly refers to Catholic social doctrine. This is a welcome development, a reminder that this body of ideas are not optional add-ons, nor are they merely ethical. They are at root doctrinal, rooted in Christian concepts about creation, sin, the incarnation, the paschal mystery, and the eschatological destiny of the human person." I even, looked up eschatological just to put it in here for readers or listeners, which is, it's just the branch of theology and philosophy concerned with the end of the world, death, judgment, and the ultimate destiny of humanity. Yeah, the Catholics love our big words, so we got to make sure that everybody is on the same page here. So back to quoting Pope Leo XIV directly, in this part where he refers to it specifically as social doctrine. He continues in that paragraph 3, quote, "When some objected that the Church should not waste energy on worldly matters, but instead focus on communicating the message of eternal life, Leo XIII responded with realism and wisdom, saying that the proclamation of the gospel cannot overlook the concrete lives of people. Many decades have passed since then, and the magisterium, pastors, theologians, and faithful have continued to reflect on social issues in the light of the gospel. Today, the social doctrine of the Church is a legacy of wisdom, where we find principles for thought, criteria for discernment and judgment, and concrete guidelines for action. Founded on sacred scripture and tradition, and in engagement with the sciences, it helps us clearly interpret the challenges of the present and identify appropriate ways for living out a clear Christian witness with joy and in service to the world. It is not an inert set of concepts, but a living corpus of truth that safeguards and interprets humanity's vocation to a full and just life. I, therefore, wish to add my own voice to this living tradition, invoking the help of the Spirit of wisdom, who has dwelt in the world since its beginning." I see Pope Leo's establishment of the social doctrine of the Church here and throughout Magnifica Humanitas as one of the most important developments of this encyclical. But before I get too much more into the weeds here, I did promise you a more general overview, which I will now give. I just really wanted to start with that quote from Pope Leo and that context with the Rerum Novarum and his predecessor, because I really do think that these are kind of the contextual foundational things to know, because I think if you kind of just jump in with any particular encyclical that any particular pope has written, it can be hard to get your bearings or to kind of understand how things are progressing. So I think those are some of the foundational things to know. Since he became the Pope, Leo has expressed concerns regarding the rise of artificial intelligence, the crises of human dignity, and multilateralism, which refers to an alliance of multiple countries pursuing a common goal, which, can be a good thing, but also could be a bad thing. This encyclical is concerned with, quote, preserving the human person in the age of artificial intelligence. Leo states that the technology could make civilization, quote, less human and reduce human dignity, as well as the value of human work. So you can see how thematically he is bringing the church's understanding of humanity's purpose and value up to speed for the digital age. In particular, this encyclical condemns the use of AI in warfare, and even goes so far as to state that just war theory has, quote, all too often been used to justify any kind of war and has become, quote, outdated. Really big deal, especially for all the conservative American nationalist Catholics who are like, just war, all about Iran. So this is a big deal. The encyclical also discourages an AI arms race and criticizes deepfakes in politics. Magnifica Humanitas asserts that technology is never neutral and uses a biblical visual of a choice between, quote, constructing Babel and rebuilding Jerusalem. Critically, the encyclical also directly apologizes for the Catholic Church's role in slavery, which is not the first time, but is deeply significant. Building on the foundations of Catholic social teaching and Rerum Novarum, like we talked about, it also stands in clear continuity with Pope Francis, both in its pastoral tone and in its direct engagement and kind of continuation of Francis's own writings and priorities. Magnifica Humanitas is laid out across 5 chapters. In Chapter 1, Pope Leo argues that Catholic social doctrine is a living process of discernment that develops as the Church encounters new historical realities. Rather than treating artificial intelligence as an isolated issue, he frames it as a challenge that requires the Church to interpret the signs of the times in continuity with the gospel, a process that depends on listening, dialogue, history, and collective discernment rather than rigid ideological certainty. What makes this especially significant is how carefully Leo situates his argument within the historical continuity of the Church's teaching tradition. The chapter repeatedly quotes and builds upon previous popes, Leo XIII and the Second Vatican Council, John the 23rd, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, to demonstrate that Catholic social doctrine has always evolved in response to changing social conditions, such as industrialization, globalization, labor exploitation, war, environmental collapse, and now artificial intelligence. In doing so, Leo presents development itself as tradition, a faithful deepening of the Church's moral understanding through history. So, if Chapter 1 is about the history of Catholic social doctrine, then Chapter 2 is an articulation of that social doctrine and how it applies to AI. A major focus of the chapter is that human dignity is inherent and cannot be reduced to productivity, efficiency, usefulness, or technological value. Leo repeatedly warns against systems that treat people as resources or data points rather than persons created in the image of God. This is like a huge theme, and he extends this critique into questions about algorithms, surveillance, labor, digital exclusion, and who controls technological power. He also argues that the Church must embody subsidiarity, that's a hard word to say, subsidiarity, transparency, accountability, and justice internally as well, especially through synodality and shared participation in decision-making. Chapter 3 is where Pope Leo turns explicitly and directly to artificial intelligence itself. The chapter examines how AI is already reshaping human relationships, labor, governance, communication, and power, while warning that technological advancement without ethical discernment can deepen inequality, exploitation, surveillance, and dehumanization. Leo is especially concerned with, quote, the technocratic paradigm, where efficiency, optimization, and control become the dominant values guiding society. Now, that phrase comes directly from Pope Francis's second encyclical, Laudato Si, which came out over 10 years ago in May of 2015. In fact, in a great piece for the National Catholic Reporter in 2015, in August after it came out, Phyllis Zagano wrote about that phrase and the already pervasive invasion of technology into nearly every aspect of human life, where screens, smartphones, social media, and constant digital connection began to mediate how people understand reality itself. I think it's very significant because obviously it has only intensified, especially with AI, because now you have to question, is that video real or is that video AI? In the essay, she raises deep philosophical questions about whether what we are encountering electronically is actually real, warning that people were treating digitally mediated experience as more meaningful than embodied human relationships, while corporations and technological systems reshape not only communication and economics, but humanity's entire relationship to truth, creation, and one another. So again, very significant that these thoughts were already being articulated before we have even reached this level of not just artificial intelligence, but maybe even artificial reality, you might say. Pope Leo does not reject technology outright. He repeatedly emphasizes that AI can be a valuable tool for human flourishing when it remains subordinate to human dignity and the common good. Much of Chapter 3 is therefore devoted to discernment, asking not simply what AI can do, but what vision of the human person is embedded within it. He critiques ideas that treat human limits, vulnerability, and dependence as problems to overcome, arguing instead that love, relationship, suffering, care, and moral freedom are essential parts of being human. The chapter ultimately presents Christian humanism as the alternative to a dehumanizing technological culture, insisting that humanity's true transcendence comes not through technological enhancement, but through grace, communion, and solidarity. In Chapter 4, which focuses on, quote, safeguarding humanity at a time of transformation, Leo is sharply critical of economic and technological models that prioritize efficiency, automation, and profit over the well-being of workers, families, and vulnerable people. He argues that AI-driven economies risk creating mass unemployment, surveillance, dependency, widening inequality, and new forms of, quote, digital slavery, where unseen laborers, exploited workers, trafficked persons, and even entire nations become resources for technological systems. Leo also condemns the power concentrated in digital platforms and algorithmic systems, criticizing how corporations and governments can manipulate public imagination, monitor behavior, and shape reality itself through data collection and AI-driven communication. One of the most important moments in Chapter 4 is Pope Leo XIV's explicit apology for the Church's historical role in tolerating and justifying slavery. Leo reflects on how both society and the Church failed for centuries to recognize the full horror of human exploitation, and he uses that history as a warning about the digital age. Humanity risks creating new forms of slavery through AI, surveillance, and exploitative labor systems, and data extraction, while convincing itself that such systems are simply the cost of progress. By drawing this comparison, Leo argues that technological advancement without an unwavering commitment to human dignity could repeat the moral blindness of the past, reducing people once again into commodities, resources, and tools for profit and control. Finally, in Chapter 5, Pope Leo focuses directly on the crisis of war in the digital age, warning that artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, automated weapons, propaganda, disinformation, and militarized technologies are making conflict faster, more impersonal, and easier to mentally justify. He argues that modern societies are increasingly shaped by a culture of power where domination, nationalism, and military force are treated as normal political tools, while human dignity and the common good are pushed aside. One of the standout moments of the chapter is his explicit rejection of just war theory, which he says has too often been used to justify violence and no longer reflects the realities of modern warfare. He warns that AI must never be allowed to make lethal decisions or reduce human beings to data points, and he repeatedly emphasizes the moral responsibility of governments, researchers, corporations, and ordinary people alike, even explicitly calling out disinformation, which I thought was a big deal. Okay, so that is that is the 5 points, the 5 chapters that encompass the document and kind of the historical context. So with all those things in mind, just obviously just from hearing about that, it is a massive, a very long, almost I think 40,000 words long, and deeply impactful a letter to read. I really enjoyed reading it, and at times I was deeply moved, and also just, I guess, really, it was really impactful to me to hear the places where Pope Leo put emphasis. I also started this episode by talking about how I'm approaching this from the perspective of an LGBTQ person. I'm transgender, so I am already on the margins of the institutional authoritative church, from a doctrinal perspective, but also just from because we have this doctrinal stance, we also have created this distance. And in many ways, Pope Francis took the first steps towards a more pastoral inclusion of people who had been historically marginalized, but it's just still that experience of living and on the outskirts of the church in so many ways. And like I said, at the beginning, I have only experienced a beautiful expansiveness of my own spiritual journey, the archetypal spiritual journey of life, the 3 parts. Life is going a certain way, then there's some sort of conflict that happens, and then from that conflict you experience a deepening, and I have experienced that. I have grown in discernment, I've grown in my relationship with God, and I feel the graces from that experience, even though it has also been incredibly challenging. And most of those challenges have come from, the social and ecclesial and, interpersonal reception that I've received. It hasn't always been easy, but I really do feel so much importance in being a voice and sharing my experiences because, there is this beautiful foundation. The Catholic Social Doctrine is a really big deal. Like, talking about what it means to recognize the dignity of the human person, and having this preferential option for the poor and the marginalized is a big deal. Like, this is what Jesus articulated directly in the Gospels and in his life, and we can see how the example of Jesus informs, not only the way that we're supposed to live our lives, but the way that we're supposed to treat other people, and all of these things. And yeah, like it's just a weird experience to read an encyclical like this, where the Pope is talking about, like, let's respect research and science, and be like, yes, I respect research and science, which is, how has led to my further developing as a person, as a transgender person, because I respect the research and the science of all the major medical associations that have said, yeah, you know what, like being trans is a real thing, and transitioning makes trans people feel better. Like it's proven. So it was very interesting to read. But I want to talk to you now as well, kind of about a 3-part response that I have to this, which kind of moves through basically the topic of integration. So first, starting with the question of integration itself, we can look at it both at the level of the person and at the level of an institution. So at an individual, like psychological level, integration is something that does not erase harm or return to some untouched sense of wholeness. It is a slow, reparative movement that can take place after fragmentation has occurred. It's a way of learning how to live, relate, and make meaning in the aftermath of damage without pretending that the damage didn't happen. This process is deeply familiar to many marginalized people who have been harmed in a vast variety of ways, and ways that the Pope touches on in this document. When I think about integration in a personal, individual sense, I definitely think about it in terms of traumas and also in the way of making sense of things that have happened to you. I think that's kind of like the base level of integration, because it doesn't have to be something incredibly damaging or incredibly big, because I guess there's a relative level to what makes something damaging first and foremost, but also integration and your sense of wholeness as a person. It's not a one size fits all process, and so I think that's part of why I started to think about this question in relationship to this document is how do we pull together like the historical harms with the noteworthy articulation of the foundational aspects like the social doctrine. Like how do we integrate the fact that there have been these harms, but we are now beginning to articulate and understand the central importance of human dignity and things like that. Like, what does that balance look like? And that's why I thought of the word integration, because I can see how bringing together is not an immediate like healing. It's not an immediate like everything is fixed now. Like the Pope apologized for slavery and that just heals it instantly. That's because that's not how it works. So when we think about integration in an institutional sense, it's more complicated. The Catholic Church is holding together its own history, the authority piece, and the lived experience of the people who exist inside and alongside of it. There's centralized teaching authority within the church that acts as a definitive interpretive voice, obviously also the voice of the Pope himself. So that voice is constantly in the process of determining what gets recognized or left out. And that can include long periods of silence or exclusion. LGBTQ people know this particularly so in a variety of different ways, whether it be often the refusal to name LGBTQ people in multiple levels within inside of the church. I think that point is made. So the second moment in this 3 acts of integration is specifically naming Magnifica Humanitas as a moment of partial integration. It's both a big deal that this letter was written, but also from another perspective, it's kind of underwhelming. It's a big deal because it takes Catholic social doctrine seriously, as seen explicitly in this move from referring to it as teaching to outright calling it doctrine. And in doing so, creates the strongest pathway to theological work that has been already developing outside the central teaching authority. The work of liberation theology, of queer theology, disability theology, Black theology, other marginalized intellectual and pastoral traditions are beginning to have further legibility within the official language of Catholic social doctrine. But then there's also the reactions to this. So people who have been doing liberation work for years outside of institutional recognition, and also people who have the lived experience of being marginalized in marginalized groups, can feel like this change is belated or insufficient, which, I mean, I really understand and agree with that. But then also, for like people who are more resistant or like fundamentalist groups, this actually can feel like a direct challenge to their understanding of what the church's moral authority actually looks like. If they have spent their lives believing that the church is a very rigid and immovable institution that has never changed and will never change, then hearing a pope lay out the history of social doctrine within the authority of papal lineage and his repeated calls for an emphasis of synodality and cooperative forms of discernment for the life of the church may feel like a direct threat. So kind of there's the partial integration piece. So then finally, and thirdly, integration here must be ongoing because it is uneven and incomplete as it stands. The church isn't arriving at a final synthesis so much as it is entering into a much longer process of trying to reconcile its authoritative voice with theological realities it has historically failed to fully recognize or name. So, this isn't undoing harm, and it doesn't smooth out the tensions between authority, lived experience, and interpretation. But it does change the conditions of what can now be said from within the authority of the church. So this is why, it's kind of difficult to synthesize, to summarize, when I read the document, when I was finished reading it, I kind of read it over 3 days. When I was finished reading it, well, actually, no, let me start with what I felt when I was reading it. When I was reading it, I felt this intense energy and excitement because it really felt revolutionary in a lot of ways of, again, putting things on the table that were historically pushed to the edge of the table, or if you're a cat, pushed off the table. A Catholic cat-holic. I don't know. That was a really bad dad joke that I tried to do, but I'm not really sure that I pulled it off that well, but that's okay. So yeah, while I was reading it, I felt this incredible energy and excitement and also deep respect for the person of Pope Leo. It really felt to me like I had an opportunity to finally see and experience what his personality is. Since he just became Pope, and hasn't had a chance to do necessarily a lot of things, has done some things, hasn't done some things that, some of us would have liked him to do. I would say notably on that point would be, I would love to have seen him meet with actual LGBTQ people and not just meet with representatives for LGBTQ people, because he met with Father James Martin of Outreach and, continued to affirm Father Jim's ministry. But he also did meet with the Courage leadership, the infamous Courage, who got really angry about the Synod Group Report 9. And I wrote about that on my Substack. But they had the opportunity to meet with the Pope as well. But, so like, I would love for him to actually meet with LGBTQ people ourselves in a visible way. It doesn't have to be a totally public event necessarily, but to just make it known that he is willing to hear and listen to our voices. I feel like a little bit of a broken record with this, but that's definitely how it feels. And there are other important issues in the church too, particularly the role of women. And I think that's kind of what I was getting at when I was talking about my experience at the end of reading it. At the end of reading Magnifica Humanitas, I really felt that what was missing, like I had immersed myself fully in the perspective of this male leader of a male institution, and I really felt like I was missing feminine energy. Like, where is the mother energy? This is very much father energy, and here are all the fathers of the church who have talked about this, and why the parental fatherly lineage of how we get to this point. But that's not the only the church is not only made up of men. It's not only made up of fathers. There are also mothers. And I'm not a woman, so I don't really have the language and the understanding of how to express what the mother energy brings fully, because it's not my experience. And as a transgender man, I have spent a lot of time deeply exploring my own masculinity to understand how to experience it, express it, and exist within the world. But when it comes to women, and it comes to what it's really comes down to the fact that women have endured so much, had to endure so much, have been so oppressed. And what is the magic in that, to be honest? Like, what is the power of that entire demographic, that entire group of people who have been through all of these things and whose voices have not been heard the way that they could be and should be? So I really did have that feeling like, man, this is this is here's a boy, and here's all the other boys that are the important boys. And I mean, obviously he does speak about women and makes it clear that he has concern and care for the oppressed and the marginalized voices. But to me, it's just reflective of how that structure is kind of unbalanced, and will be unbalanced until we start to have this process of integration. Because women are a part of the church, and all the marginalized people are part of it too. And within what Christianity teaches and believes, this is the other part where I feel like a broken record, where it's like, like Jesus did say to love everybody, and that love, is going to include everybody. And so, we should have systems, and we should act in such a way that is reflective of inclusion, rather than kind of having that that method of closing rank, I guess. But it will always be a balance because of what Catholicism is structurally. So ultimately, it's really hard to figure out how to articulate that kind of contradiction where it's like, this is something exciting but also a little disappointing. So I'm going to move into my conclusion now, where I kind of unpack that a little bit more, and and we'll go from there. So what makes Magnifica Humanitas difficult to categorize is that it is doing foundational work in a field, in a way, that hasn't been fully developed within the institutional life of the church itself. So that impacts how we understand it in its tone, its limitations, and even in its apparent simplicity. So it is very basic and foundational, because the conditions for thinking about these topics in depth have so long been constrained by this singular, institutionally male perspective. So what feels rudimentary here is what happens when discourse is finally starting to surface after years of delay, silence, and fragmentation. So again, that's why I brought up integration. At the level of the person, integration is never about restoring an untouched wholeness, but about learning how to live in the aftermath of fracture without denying it. And that can apply to a person who has been harmed, as well as a person who has done harm, as seen within the principle, the concept of restorative justice. So here with Magnifica Humanitas, something similar is happening at the level of theological and moral discourse. The document is not repairing history or totally resolving the harm done forever, but attempting a kind of integration after long periods in which key realities, especially around slavery, violence, and just war, were either inadequately named or only partially theologically processed within official teaching. Even its most striking and important moments of acknowledgement in the document, such as its engagement with slavery or its reframing of the moral language of war, there is a tension and a feeling of delayed recognition. There isn't a tidy finality or a feeling of settled resolution, because that's not how integration and true justice work. Restorative justice, again, for example, is responsive to both the context in question and the lived reality of victims. So a little bit more about, restorative justice. So in the field of criminology, restorative justice is not primarily about punishment, but about processes of repair that bring together those who have been harmed, those who have caused harm, and the broader communities affected. Its aim is to create conditions in which harm can be named honestly, responsibility can be taken, and the possibility of repair, material, relational, and moral, can be collectively discerned. Instead of what rule was broken and what penalty is due, it asks, who has been harmed, what are their needs, and what would it mean to put things right? In that sense, restorative justice is always responsive to lived reality. It refuses the idea that harm can simply be dismissed or resolved by a kind of formal court declaration. But it is also capable of holding space for accountability, as well as the possibility of transformation and change. Seen in that light, the Encyclical's gestures toward slavery and just war resembles something closer to an ongoing restorative process rather than a completed moral settlement. They introduce into the Church's authoritative voice questions that have long been raised from its margins. Who has been harmed? What obligations follow from that harm? And what would repair even look like within a tradition that has also been implicated in sustaining it? And like restorative justice, this process does not assume reconciliation is automatic or complete. It is uneven, contested, and dependent on whether those with institutional authority are willing to remain in sustained relationship to the realities being named. Restorative justice frameworks are deliberately open-ended. They aim at accountability and repair, but they do not guarantee harmony, nor do they erase the conditions that made harm possible in the first place. The same is true of Magnifica Humanitas. The encyclical marks a real shift in what can now be said from within the Church's magisterial voice, but it does not and cannot resolve the historical asymmetries. That word is also hard. It cannot resolve the historical asymmetries that produced the need for such a delayed articulation of reality. It is, in other words, a form of integration that is real but incomplete, one that allows previously marginalized theological realities to find more connection points within the institutional Church while still not being fully integrated yet. So what we are looking at is not resolution, but a shift in the conditions of intelligibility. A moment where previously marginalized theological realities begin to enter the Church's center as part of its own developing self-understanding, which is exciting. And that in itself is both the promise and the limit of integration as it is actually lived out. So that's my commentary on the kind of strange experience of reading something like Magnifica Humanitas that is both exciting and a little disappointing. I choose to stay in these spaces because I want the church to heal and to find the truth that those on the margins have always known. Things like dignity is not granted by institutions, but already present in people's lived experience, that harm is often systemic, and theological language has been used to justify or obscure it. And finally, that belonging is not something you can earn by performing something inauthentic, but something that is a matter of human dignity and justice. Thank you for joining me for this episode. And as always, you can send me comments if you want on this episode in particular by going to Substack at maxwellkuzma.substack.com. Thanks for being here.